Hi guys, Drew from Aloha Plant Life here, and today I'm going to be doing a care video for you guys on what is commonly known as string of plants. Now, what I'm talking about when I say string of plants are plants that until a few years back were all classified as Senecios. You've actually heard me most often refer to them as Senecios in all of my videos. Technically, they're now Curios is the genus, but if you hear Senecio or Curio, these are the plants I'm talking about. I've had so many people tell me that these are the hardest plants for them, that they just cannot keep them alive no matter what they do, and I honestly have not had a very difficult experience with mine personally, so I figured I would film this video and kind of tell you guys what I do and what I think I see a lot of other people do that leads to problems and kind of troubleshooting problems and all the things. So let's just go ahead and head right into it, and I will let you know that I actually recently got a new variety of a string of plant that will be making its debut here a little later in this video, so super excited about that. But first of all, you guys have seen in previous videos two of my, now I own three string of plants, two of them quite frequently, and one is my string of bananas that's hanging back here, and then I've got Pearl, my little string of pearls, sitting next to my string of bananas. So I want to start with Pearl because one of these plants, the new one I got, is actually a hybrid of what Pearl is and another type of Curio. So Pearl is commonly known as a Senecio, see there I go, saying Senecio again, a Senecio or a Curio rowleyanus. And so you've seen Pearl before here with these cute little pearl, or maybe even green pea if you think about it, shaped leaves on these tiny little vines, and she was just a little baby when I got her, but she's already grown quite a bit, and all of these plants are very fast growing, so keep that in mind. If you're buying a baby one, it'll grow quickly. But yeah, definitely she's getting a lot longer now. I'm absolutely loving it. And she is the second string of plant that I got. The first one was my string of bananas back here. So let me trade Pearl out for her. So this is my string of bananas, and a string of bananas is now called Curio radicans, previously Senecio radicans, and called a string of bananas because of these little banana-shaped leaves here, also sometimes referred to as a string of fishhooks as well. In addition to these two, I have recently acquired what is commonly known as a string of dolphins. And like I mentioned a second ago, it is a hybrid of what Pearl is, which is the Curio rowleyanus, along with a Curio articulatus, which looks nothing like any of these string of plants. So I'm really kind of confused about how that hybrid came along. Who knows? So I did buy this string of dolphins as a little 2-inch plant, kind of like what I did with Pearl, because one of my friends slash ex-personal training clients slash ex-employee, she's pretty much been all the things to me at some point or another. She got me for Christmas this real cute little orange tabby cat hanger, since Toby is an orange tabby. And so this is a hanging planter, and it's relatively small, so I really wanted to put something cute and small and 2-inch in here, and immediately I thought of the string of dolphins. And the string of dolphins scientific name is Curio peregrinus, previously Senecio peregrinus. And as you can see, let me see if I can get up close enough here so that you can see how these leaves are shaped, but they kind of look like jumping dolphins. So if you see there, they have like a little kind of fin shape coming out of like the top there on that arched leaf that makes it look like a jumping dolphin. And then as they get older, they kind of flatten out like this, and I feel like they look more like a little stingray. But either way, super, super cute, very fast growing as well. So this will start to trail pretty quickly. It's already starting to trail, as you can see here. This one's just kind of curling upwards for whatever reason now. But that's going to be a really, really cute plant for this cute little planter that my friend got me. But all three of these plants are going to have the same care requirements. And so we're going to go through all of the care requirements. I'm going to touch a little bit on propagation, all kinds of things today. So let's go ahead and start out with lighting, because I feel like lighting is one of two main care requirements with these plants that if you do not get it right, you're not going to have a lot of success with these plants. So these plants really, really want a lot of light. And typically they're going to want it more indirect, but I actually have mine all in southern facing windows. They aren't directly in the window, but they're about a foot back, and they've done fine. They get a fair amount of direct light, but once again, just always acclimate your plants into the space, see how they're doing, pull them back if you need to pull them back, but definitely they want a lot of light. And if you don't get the light up on the surface of these plants, and honestly, you guys, this goes for almost any vining hanging plant. If you don't get enough light up on the surface here, this will start to bald. All of the foliage up here will go away, shrivel up, die, and you'll be left with just the vines and the foliage down here, because this is the foliage that is actually getting the light. So if you don't want a bald plant for these plants, make sure there is light hitting the surface of that plant. Now, it is common when you're acclimating these plants to your house to have some foliage loss. And I think that is one thing that freaks people out, and they think something's wrong, like it needs to be watered, or it's been overwatered, or it's getting too much light, or whatever it may be. But sometimes plants, when they're acclimating their homes, are gonna lose leaves because they're confused. They're in a new, different environment. They don't know what's going on. So another big thing to make sure you don't do is overreact when you first bring this plant into your home. The number one thing I would check for, though, if you see a lot of leaf loss when you first bring it home, is pests. Just make sure there's not some kind of pest situation going on that is causing that leaf loss, because it is possible. These plants are, in my experience, mostly prone to mealybugs. That's really the main one I've ever seen. And pearls never had a bug problem. Obviously, I just got the String of Dolphins, so far so good, no bugs. But I did have mealybugs that I discovered probably about 2 or 3 weeks after I got my string of bananas, and I was able to go through and just remove them all by hand, and we have not had a pest problem since. But always check for those pests first when you bring it home if you start to see that leaf loss. If there are no bugs, give it a week or two as it's still acclimating, and it should eventually stop doing that as you're getting it used to your home and moving it into the correct lighting situation. So the next big thing that has to be discussed is watering, because the number one way to kill any string of plant is to overwater it. Now, I mentioned lighting is very key as well, but when you don't have lighting right and you're overwatering, now it's just a recipe for disaster. And so I think that's what happens a lot, is people don't have it in bright enough light, and then they're giving it too much water. These plants do want to dry all the way out. And what I do, and I've said this before, is I let them dry out. I have them in cover pots, in their nursery pots. I check the bottom of it if it looks dry. Then I start squeezing the leaves that are closest up at the base of that plant. Just give them a little pinch, a little squeeze, and if they feel slightly squishy and not firm, then I water them. I give them a nice deep watering. I make sure all the water has drained out. I put them back in their cover pot, and I don't touch them again for at least 2 weeks. And Pearl here is relatively small, so her pot's gonna dry out more quickly than, say, the string of bananas. So I am gonna have to water her more frequently than this plant, but I do the same thing with the string of bananas. So just remember, let it dry out, keep an eye on if it's looking dry, and then just give it the squishy test up at the soil level on those leaves. That has worked well for me and other people that I have recommended it to. So if you haven't been doing that, give that a try, because that might right there just resolve all the problems that you've been having. But just in case it doesn't, we're gonna move on to some other care aspects for these plants. So I do wanna say real quick, I do hear a lot of people say they're succulents, so you need to treat them like succulents. They're succulent-like is the way I like to think about it. And yes, they actually are succulents, that's not wrong, but they're a little bit different in their growth pattern. I mean, the fact that they're vining is like a big difference between like a regular like upright succulent, like say an Echeveria or Graptiveria. So it's a little bit of a different animal, and therefore I don't treat them like I treat my other succulents. I don't at all. And one of the big things that I do that's different comes into play with the soil. So for these in the soil, I do not use my standard Bonsai Jack's Gritty mix that I use for my other succulents, because it's not enough actual soil. So I don't know if I've ever given you a real good close-up of this. So here is my Bonsai Jack's Gritty mix. You can see it's mostly gravel, bark, it's very chunky. There's not a lot of dirt, as you would say, in here. And that works fine for my other succulents. But these trailing succulents that I have, like all of these around me, the string of bananas, string of pearls, string of dolphins, they want more soil than that in my experience. So I highly recommend that if you are using something like my Bonsai Jack's Gritty mix, that you do at least a 50-50 ratio of that to your premium potting soil. Your other option is to use a store-bought, pre-made cactus and succulent soil mix that is specifically designed for cacti and succulents. So here's one that I have recently purchased because I wanted to test how it works on my string of plants in comparison to my own mixture that I've been doing, and see if one works better than the other, just as a little experiment, because sometimes I just like to experiment, so then I can let you guys know what works best. But you can see here what this looks like. This is not anywhere near as chunky as my mixture that I'm making with that super chunky Bonsai Jack's Gritty mix, but it still has the extra drainage in it, and that is the big thing, because as I mentioned, the number one easiest way I think to kill these plants is to overwater it. And if you have a soil that is not well draining enough, then they're sitting in water and they do not like to have wet feet at all. So you have to have that well draining soil. Now, I have also mentioned in the past that I do not repot plants right away when I bring them home, and that I usually wait at least a month or so if they're looking like they're gonna need to be repotted before I do it. This might be a plant where I might be willing to make an exception, because if you bought it and you can tell it wasn't in a soil like that cacti succulent soil with extra drainage, you're gonna wanna get it out of that pretty quickly. I would still give it maybe at least a week to acclimate to your home before you go crazy with it. But yeah, you definitely don't want it in a soil that is going to just sit there and cause issues. You're gonna wanna get it out of that and into a more appropriate soil. Which also brings me to another point. Even if it is in the right kind of soil at the store where you bought it from, how it's been treated at that store is a big question mark. And so when you're at the store and you're shopping for string of plants in particular, it might look super healthy. So like the string of dolphins that I just got the other day, right? Looks totally super, super healthy. There's nothing to concern me there on that plant. But I checked it because it was wet. It was like it had just been watered. I very carefully slipped it out of its pot and I took a look at the roots to see how they were looking. I wanted to make sure it hadn't been overwatered, because at a lot of these stores, and especially this time of year when they're getting busier and they're hiring students who are home from college for the summer, and they're not necessarily totally experienced in how to water plants, and they're going around and they're just watering, you know, every day. And I know it's happening because at the store that I bought this at, there was a big sign plopped in the middle of the table it was on that said in permanent Sharpie, "Do not water," which clued me in that somebody probably been overwatering these. So I definitely, after I saw that sign, was gonna slip it out and check its roots. And its roots were fine. But you always wanna check with these at the store, because sometimes the root situation is already like past the point of return, and the upper part still looks good, but then you get it into your home and it starts declining and you're like, what the heck is going on? And in reality, it had just been improperly taken care of at the store where you bought it. So always pay close attention, especially to these, when you're buying them at the stores, especially at big box stores, because I tend to find way more overwatering situations at big box stores than anywhere else. So back to repotting. So let's say that you bought this cute little string of dolphins and you brought it home. Actually, let's use the string of bananas for example again. Give me 1 second. So you bought this cute little string of bananas from your local store. Everything looked good at the store, but you noticed that the soil was really not the right type of soil. But at least the roots still look good, so you're lucky, right? Now you're gonna repot it. I'm sure you're looking at this thinking this is gonna be a nightmare to repot, right? I've heard a lot of different various techniques on repotting these to make it easier. I'm gonna share all of them with you, but the last one I'm gonna tell you is what I think is the easiest, and is what I'm going to do when I have to repot this one. So they are very fast growing, as I stated. I've already propagated her once and taken like a foot or so off of the bottom. So they will grow back quickly. So from that regard, you could trim it shorter to make it easier, and I will cover how to then propagate everything that you cut off a little bit later in this video. But you could cut it shorter, propagate what you cut off, and then that'll make it easier to flip this upside down, get it out of its pot without everything getting jumbled up. That's one thing you can do, and if you were wanting to propagate the plant anyway, honestly, that actually probably is what I would do in that situation if I was wanting to propagate it regardless. Another thing I've heard people say to do is that you take these and you fold them up on the top, and that bundles everything up here so it's easier to work with, and then you just untangle them afterwards. I just got it tangled, not even taking it all the way up there to show you that right now, and I really don't want to be sitting around trying to untangle this like for hours and hours and hours. So if you have the time to do that and you want to just tuck them up there, that's fine. You go ahead and do that, but I'm going to do something else. So what I am going to do when I have to repot this is I'm going to use chopsticks. And I got this idea because, well, let me back it up for a second. These leaves on all of these plants are a little bit delicate, and you probably will lose some in the process of repotting if you're doing anything that I've mentioned so far. I feel like what I'm about to tell you to do to repot will result in the least amount of leaf loss, but these leaves don't bump off nearly as easily as on my donkey tail succulent. That is my hanging succulent that I've told you about before, where you barely bump it and the leaves fall off. That plant is going to be super tricky to repot, but I already know exactly what I'm going to do to repot it, and what I'm going to do there will work here too. So what you will need is 3 chopsticks. Well, depending on the size of your plant, more or less. But what you're going to do is you're going to use those chopsticks and you're going to drive them at an angle down into that soil pretty far in various different points. And then you're going to grab those chopsticks together, not with one hand unless it's a smaller plant and you can with one hand, but if I wasn't using this hand to hold her up, I would be using both hands to hold those chopsticks, and I'm going to use those chopsticks to lift this plant up out of its pot. And now I've got it out and I didn't have to tip it upside down. That's where everything goes crazy is with these plants, is when you have to tip them upside down to try to get them out of the pot. Now, you also might still have a hard time getting it out of the pot, even if you've squeezed the pot and everything to get it out. If that happens and it's still in like a nursery pot like this, just cut the pot off. It'll make your life a lot easier. And then as far as what kind of pot you're going to put this in. Okay, I roll my eyes because this is another one of those areas where I don't necessarily agree. As you know, I keep my plants in nursery pots and then I put them into cover pots, and that includes these guys. I have not had a problem with having them in plastic pots, but I, once again, am very careful about the type of soil they're in, the type of light they're getting, and letting them completely dry out before I water them again. However, is plastic pot ideal for this type of plant? Not necessarily. It doesn't like to have wet feet. If you are getting your watering and your light and everything else correct like I am, I'm 100% confident you will be okay in a plastic pot. But if you're worried about it, the best type of pot is going to be a clay pot, like a terracotta pot, a basalt pot, or a concrete pot. You want something that's porous, that's going to help wick that moisture away from those roots, and all of those types of pots will do that. So that's going to be the option that you're going to want to go with. Now also, keep in mind, these plants have a very shallow, delicate root system. It's not super vast. So you've heard me talk about like my peperomias before, having that real wispy, thin, shallow roots. Similar situation here. So you never want to get them into a pot that's too deep. Now this is in, I believe this looks like a 6-inch pot right now. This is as deep of a pot as I would probably ever put one of these plants in, because once you get too deep, that root system, it's not going to be able to get all the way to the bottom. It's just not that vast and deep of a root structure. So if you've ever been at the plant store and you've seen those really shallow and much wider pots and wondered, what kind of plant is this for? Those actually typically are there for succulents. And so a lot of those pots, you can find them almost anywhere, and they're going to work great for this. And when you're going up in size, so let me put her back aside since she's kind of a different situation because she's already big. Let me show you one of the smaller ones and what you would be looking to do for pot size. So whenever I get to the point of needing to repot Pearl out of this little 2-inch pot, I'm only gonna take her up to a 3-inch pot. I'm not even gonna go to a 4-inch pot because that root system is so delicate and it does not like to be kept wet. Definitely, literally only one pot size, meaning only 1 inch bigger for these plants. And once you get to the size of this string of bananas pot, the 6-inch pot, you're gonna go up one pot size wider, but not deeper. So just keep that in mind. That's the best way to go about it. And remember too, after you have repotted any type of plant, it is not uncommon to see some leaf loss, to see some weirdness going on as it's getting adjusted to its new pot. So don't panic if you see anything like that right after repotting any of your string of plants. So let's talk about temperature and humidity. Humidity, not an issue for these plants. They don't want super high humidity. They're from arid environments, so they'll be fine with just normal humidity in your house. As far as temperature goes, they do like to be on the warmer side. I'm not saying you're gonna have to keep your house at like 80 degrees or something like that. Not that they wouldn't like 80 degrees, but you don't need to keep your thermostat at 80 to keep them happy. They will be fine as long as your house is somewhere between like probably 65 to 75. And always make sure you're not putting them directly in line with a cold or a hot draft either, because that can really affect these leaves and cause them to shrivel up and dry up quicker and die off. So that's another thing to keep in mind. If you're seeing some leaf loss and it's looking like it's just crispy, dried up leaves, make sure it doesn't have any kind of draft blowing directly on it. And as far as fertilization goes, once again, I don't treat them like my other succulents, because my other succulents, I don't fertilize that often because A, they're much slower growing than these, and B, they have much bigger leaves that are holding much more water and much more of the nutrients from the fertilizer in them than these. So I actually fertilize these once a month, just like I do most of my plants during the growing season. And as long as they're still growing in the winter, I still fertilize them once a month, and I have never had a problem. And I will say, I've just been using a standard 999 liquid fertilizer on these guys, and once again, I've had no problems. But ideally, they would probably prefer a more succulent-specific fertilizer combination, which would be something like a 247 or a 347 liquid fertilizer. Now, let's say you've taken all this information I've told you so far, and you've gotten it all perfect. You are going to be rewarded sometime in probably late fall, maybe early winter, with flowers on these plants. And they come in as these little white flowers that almost look like little pom-poms. They're not the most attractive flowers, but they smell fabulous. They smell like cinnamon, and it's not overwhelming where you're gonna walk into a room and be like, whoa, what is that? But when you get up close to them, you'll be able to smell it, and it's really nice. And especially because like cinnamon, when we're heading into late fall, early winter holiday season, I mean, that's like one of the spices for the holidays, right? So hopefully you will be blessed with flowers this year because you've watched this video and you're gonna get all these care requirements, right? But if they don't bloom, don't worry about it because they still just look totally great by themselves without any kind of flowers on them. But you do want to remove those flowers as they become kind of wilted and spent off of the plant. So make sure you keep an eye on that in doing that if you do get blooms. So the last thing I want to cover here is propagation. These are really quite easy to propagate, although once again, I have had people say that they've had problems doing it before, but there are several ways to propagate them, and maybe it was just that particular one was not working for them for some reason and they need to try a different one. So I think the easiest one to do is actually water propagating. So you would want to take one of your long vines like we have like right here and cut it off wherever exactly it is that you're wanting to cut it off. Let's say perhaps you're wanting to cut it off right about here. What you would want to do is you would want to remove all of these pearls up here so that you have some bare stem, which I think I just knocked a pearl off. Ugh. And that's what I'm saying. They are still a little bit sensitive, not quite as sensitive as the donkey's tail, but they will still pop off if you're not careful. But you would want to remove those pearls. Then you would take that end of the stem and just put it into water. Make sure you still have some pearls down here, or bananas or dolphins, whichever plant you're doing. Make sure you still have some down here. Make sure those don't go into the water and just let it sit there in a bright indirect light place. And eventually it will develop roots and you can transfer it to soil. But another option is you can actually take, let's look at the string of bananas again. So if you had a lot of growth like this, you could take multiple of your cuttings and you could just wind them around onto the surface of some soil. Make sure that soil has been wet down. Make sure they're just sitting there in contact with the surface of the soil. If you need to use some clips like a bobby pin, open it wide, put it down on there, or some paper clips or something to keep it down in the soil, you can. And then just make sure that the top of that soil is staying relatively moist. Just use a spray bottle to mist it or something like that. And eventually it will root down into that and then start to grow new vines that will trail over the sides. So that's another way that you can propagate it. However, in that situation, because this is actually a succulent, you're gonna need to let it callus over before you do that. So all that means is once you cut it, you're gonna set it aside for like a day or two because these vines are really thin. It's not gonna take them that long to dry out, but you just wanna make sure the ends where you cut have dried and gotten hard like a callus before you go putting them into that pot. But the absolute easiest way to propagate these is to self-propagate them. And what is self-propagating? Self-propagating is actually also referred to as soil layering, not air layering. That is a completely very different thing, and you can't air layer these plants, but soil layering you can do. But basically in soil layering, all you do is you take a pot of soil, you wet it down just like I was talking about for those vines if you were gonna coil them around on the surface of the soil to do it that way. You're gonna take that pot though, and you're gonna put it underneath your mother plant. So I would put a pot right underneath her, and then I would drape her vines into that pot. And then once again, if I needed to, I could pin it down with some clips to hold it in place. And then I'm just going to leave that pot there for a few weeks. Once again, I'm going to make sure the surface of that soil stays moist. I'll be misting it if I needed to. And then after a few weeks, roots will start to develop and grow down into that pot. And once these vines have rooted, then you can cut them off of the mother plant. Now, why this is the easiest method to do this is because the mother plant is now still alive and keeping these vines alive and giving them support to actually root before you cut it away. So much higher success rate because the plant is alive the whole time. You haven't cut it off and now it's just trying to do something that it's never done before. So that is honestly the way that I would do it. It's pretty much foolproof, you guys. But if you don't have space to do it, or if your plant's not quite this long and you're wanting to propagate it, then by all means do either the water method or the coiling on top of soil method. Both of those will work. I do think the water one is probably the easiest if it's your first time propagating it and you don't want to do the self-propagation method, so perhaps try that one first. So the last thing I want to mention when it comes to caring for all of these beautiful little string of plants is don't panic. The number one thing I think people do is they see dried up desiccated leaves on this, and even though the soil is still wet, they read those dried up desiccated leaves as, oh my gosh, I need to water it. And then they overwater it and it dies. There are a bunch of things that can cause those dried up leaves that I've already mentioned, like too much airflow on it. It's just acclimating to your house. It's not getting enough light on the top of the soil, so those leaves at the base of the soil are starting to die off and it's balding up top, but the rest of it is fine. Mealy bugs could be a reason for it. There are a lot of things that could be the reason for that have nothing to do with watering. So just be calm, think logically through it, think about the things I've told you today, and don't just have that trigger response of going to grab the watering can. And I promise you, you can grow and keep happy, healthy, thriving string of plants in your house if you just follow some of these simple care requirements that I've outlined for you today. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. I hope this information has been helpful for you. If you have struggled with any of these adorable little string of plants before, please comment down below and let us know what your struggles were so we can all learn from one another. And if you have not yet hit that like and or subscribe button down below, please do so. And I look forward to seeing you guys again next time. Aloha!